What if the person who knows your deepest secrets, your earliest impulses, your most calculated decisions, and your darkest intentions suddenly decided they'd had enough and told the world everything? What if the one person you always assumed would protect you became the one who exposed you? Because that is exactly what the world believes happened the moment Doria Ragland opened her mouth live on air and uttered the sentence that sent Meghan Markle into an absolute spiral. She planned her future in phases, and nothing ever happened by accident. The moment those words left Doria's lips, you could practically feel the internet explode. Commentators rewound the clip. Pundits jumped on emergency live streams. Journalists began contacting former friends and acquaintances. And Meghan? According to insiders, she froze like someone who had just watched the ground split open beneath her feet. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's be honest, public figures deal with scandals all the time. Rumors, leaks, awkward interviews, bad press cycles. It's part of the game. But this wasn't a leak from an anonymous source. This wasn't a disgruntled former assistant. This wasn't a random comment from a distant relative. This was the person Meghan has always called her rock, her moral compass, her quiet pillar of support. This was her mother, the one figure Meghan insisted had stood by her through every phase of her life. The one person who knew every carefully crafted version of Meghan, because she watched them unfold up close. And suddenly, that same mother was on national television hinting, intentionally or not, that Meghan's rise, her relationships, her choices, and even her public persona were part of a long, calculated blueprint. So the question becomes, why now? And why this? Why did Doria say something so pointed, so loaded, so layered with implication that it instantly made people rethink everything they thought they knew about Meghan's past and her present? Was it a slip? A moment of emotional honesty? A strategic decision of her own? Or was it a quiet cry for help from a mother who had reached her breaking point? The truth is, whatever the reason, the impact was immediate. People who had known Meghan years earlier suddenly began coming forward with suspiciously consistent stories. Little anecdotes that once seemed harmless or irrelevant now took on new meaning. Teachers, neighbors, former coworkers, family acquaintances, they all seemed to echo the same thing. Meghan didn't stumble into anything. She planned. She plotted. She maneuvered. She positioned herself. She reinvented and restructured anytime circumstances didn't match her vision. And Doria's unexpected declaration suddenly validated everything these people had been saying for years. But let's zoom out for a moment. Why does this story matter now? Why did this particular televised moment trigger the biggest conversation around Meghan's character since the royal exit? It's simple. This wasn't about gossip. This was about credibility, authenticity, the morality of ambition, the difference between resilience and manipulation. For years, Meghan has presented herself as someone who simply wanted to find her voice, tell her truth, and overcome adversity. But Doria's words challenged that narrative at its core. They suggested a version of events where nothing was random, nothing was spontaneous, and nothing was ever as organic as it seemed. And that's what captured global attention. People started asking uncomfortable questions. Did Meghan pursue Hollywood as a career, or as a stepping stone? Did she marry Trevor out of love, or for the industry access that came with it? Did she meet Harry by chance, or through strategically cultivated connections? Did she reinvent herself at each stage to adapt, or to manipulate? Did she build her life authentically, or according to a hidden script only she understood? These aren't new questions. They've floated around tabloids and internet forums for years. But when Doria said what she said, they suddenly gained legitimacy. Because if Meghan's own mother was implying that her daughter's life was built on phases, deliberate, pre-planned, meticulously executed phases, then the public could no longer dismiss those rumors as exaggerated negativity or online conspiracy. And that's when the real unraveling began. News outlets started running timelines of Meghan's life, highlighting moments that now looked less like coincidence and more like strategy. Clips resurfaced where Meghan spoke about being interested in royalty long before she met Harry. Former colleagues shared stories about her shifting personalities depending on who she was speaking to. Old interviews from Suits cast members gained renewed attention. Even comments from childhood friends were suddenly viewed through a new lens. But here's the twist. Doria never said Meghan did anything evil. She didn't accuse her of wrongdoing. She didn't expose a scandal. She didn't reveal illegal activity. All she did was lift the curtain a little. She offered the smallest glimpse behind the polished narrative. She suggested intentionality. And sometimes, intentionality is more devastating than accusation. Because when people believe you've been carefully curating your entire life, it makes everything you say afterward feel unreliable. And that's when Meghan's panic kicked in. According to several sources, Meghan watched the interview live. She wasn't there physically, but she had been told Doria would be discussing harmless topics, family dynamics, wellness, motherhood, mindfulness. Nothing controversial, nothing inflammatory, nothing remotely threatening. So when Doria dropped the line about phases and intention, Meghan reportedly jumped up from her seat, grabbed her phone, and immediately tried to reach her mother. Witnesses described her as visibly shaken, pacing, whispering frantically, as if she had just witnessed something dangerous spiral out of her control. Because for Meghan, control has always been everything. And that's where this story shifts. The revelation didn't just shake Meghan's image. It shook her relationship with her mother. The woman she has always claimed was her closest confidant had, intentionally or not, undermined the foundation of Meghan's carefully curated public identity. And if Doria was willing to share that much on live television, what else might she say if pushed? What else might slip out? What other truths might be sitting quietly in the back of her mind, waiting for the wrong interviewer, the right moment, or the perfect emotional trigger? But let's go deeper. Why would Doria say something so explosive in the first place? Was it frustration? Regret? Exhaustion? A desire to distance herself from Meghan's controversies? Or was it something far more human? A mother finally releasing the truth she'd been carrying for years? Because make no mistake, that sentence, said so calmly, carried decades of weight. It came from someone who had watched Meghan evolve, adapt, transform, and reinvent herself again and again. Someone who had seen the private version of Meghan long before the cameras ever rolled. And it wasn't just the words. It was Doria's tone. Observers pointed out that Doria's voice wavered slightly. Her eyes softened. Her smile faded. She looked like someone wrestling with a complicated mix of love, worry, and painful honesty. As if she wanted to protect her daughter, but could no longer protect the narrative. And here's where things get even more interesting. Once the clip went viral, attention turned not just to Meghan's past, but to Doria's. People began examining their relationship, their dynamic, their differences, their similarities, their disagreements. Reporters dug into the timeline of when Doria appeared publicly with Meghan and when she stayed silent. They revisited early interviews where Doria seemed supportive but detached, affectionate but cautious. Suddenly, even the smallest gestures and comments were being analyzed, dissected, interpreted. Because when a relationship cracks, people start looking for the fracture points. But the real question, the most crucial question, isn't about timing or motive or interpretation. It's about consequence. What did Doria actually reveal about Meghan's past? What specific incidents made the public believe Meghan's life was engineered in phases? What stories from Meghan's childhood, teenage years, Hollywood days, and royal transition support this idea of strategic reinvention? What behaviors did Doria witness that now seem connected to that one chilling sentence? Because the truth is, the interview was only the spark. The real firestorm began when people from Meghan's past started validating Doria's words. A former classmate mentioned Meghan's obsession with being known. A college acquaintance recalled Meghan talking about wanting a life bigger than acting. An ex-boyfriend claimed Meghan always analyzed people's value in her long-term goals. A Suits co-star referenced her chameleon behavior. A family friend remembered Doria whispering once that Meghan always had a plan, even if no one knew what it was. These aren't isolated stories. They form a pattern, a rhythm, a sequence, a series of phases. Phase 1, childhood identity formation. Phase 2, Hollywood ascent. Phase 3, elite social circles. Phase 4, the royal pursuit. Phase 5, global branding. Phase 6, reinvention after public backlash. Phase 7, the next pivot, whatever it may be. And suddenly, Doria's words didn't sound like a shock. They sounded like confirmation. So here's the question for the audience. If Meghan's entire trajectory has been intentional, what happens when the plan finally fails? Because according to multiple insiders, that is exactly what is happening right now. Meghan's branding efforts are faltering. Her media deals have evaporated. Hollywood is distancing itself. Public trust is thinning. And for the first time in her adult life, Meghan's next phase isn't clear. Which brings us to the moment that truly shattered Meghan's composure. Because while the world focused on Doria's viral clip, Meghan was focused on something else. Something much more terrifying to her personally. It wasn't what Doria said. It was what Doria was about to say next. And that is where this story really begins. Because if you think Doria revealing Meghan's strategic life phases was shocking, wait until you hear the next line she uttered, the one that made Meghan Markle run with her tail between her legs, desperate to stop the unraveling before it reached the point of no return. What exactly did Doria say in those next few seconds that made Meghan panic like she'd just watched her entire future collapse? That's the question everyone keeps asking. And the truth is, the moment Doria continued speaking, the air in the studio changed. You can see it, feel it. Even through the screen, something shifts. Her tone drops. Her eyes stop wandering and anchor on the interviewer like she's finally ready to say something she's been swallowing for years. And you know that feeling you get right before someone drops a truth bomb you're not prepared for? That's the exact feeling people around the world reported as they watched the clip go viral. Because here's the mini hook. Doria didn't just hint at Meghan's phases. She hinted at something darker. Something planned, yes, but also concealed. Something Meghan thought would stay buried forever. And when Doria started to speak that second sentence, Meghan wasn't thinking about public perception, PR damage, or palace politics. She was thinking about survival, about shutting the entire thing down before the truth could take on a life of its own. Now ask yourself this. What kind of confession from your own mother would terrify you more than any tabloid, journalist, or critic ever could? The moment the interviewer leaned forward and asked Doria to elaborate, just a simple, gentle, "What do you mean by phases?" Doria inhaled. Slow, controlled, almost painful. And then she said a line no one expected. She always knew exactly what she wanted, and she learned to get it, no matter what she had to adjust along the way. And that's where everything began to crumble. Let's break down why those words hit harder than any headline Meghan has faced in her entire career. It's not the words themselves. It's the implication behind them, no matter what she had to adjust. That's the line commentators immediately seized on. What does adjust mean? People? Relationships? Situations? Identity? Truth? It's one of those sentences so vague that it invites 1,000 interpretations, and so pointed that every interpretation feels incriminating. But here's where the twist really begins. That phrase didn't just land with viewers. It landed with people from Meghan's past. People who had their own stories, their own memories, their own adjustments they claim Meghan made. And when those people heard Doria's words, something inside them snapped. Within minutes, an old college acquaintance posted a cryptic tweet. A Suits extra wrote an Instagram story referencing direction changes. A former friend from her 20s sent a DM to a journalist saying, "This is what we tried to warn you about." Small ripples, yes, but ripples that began multiplying so fast they soon turned into a tidal wave of resurfaced anecdotes. But let's go back to the broadcast for a moment, because everything that happened afterward only makes sense if you understand what happened in those few seconds on camera. The live studio was silent. The interviewer was silent. Even Doria seemed to realize she'd crossed into territory she couldn't easily retreat from. There was no going back, no laughing it off, no rephrasing it. And viewers noticed the micro-expression. That half-second flicker of regret, or maybe acceptance, that passed over Doria's face. As if she knew she'd just opened a door that Meghan had spent years, maybe decades, barricading shut. And this is the contradiction that fascinated audiences. Doria looked calm and composed, but she also looked tired. Really tired. Not physically, emotionally, spiritually. The kind of tired that comes from carrying a truth you're not allowed to talk about. And then finally, one day, you do. Have you ever kept a secret so heavy that when you finally tell it, you feel both terrified and relieved at the same time? That was Doria in this moment. But while Doria's confession set the world on fire, Meghan's reaction was the real headline. According to an insider present at the house where Meghan was watching the live broadcast, she didn't just panic, she unraveled. One person described it as a meltdown that was part shock, part rage, part fear. She reportedly shouted at her phone, demanded answers, and even ordered staff to cut the feed, as if it were possible to stop a live national interview from continuing. But here's the part that truly made observers raise an eyebrow. Meghan didn't panic because Doria revealed something scandalous. She panicked because Doria revealed something true. Let's be clear. A lie is easy to fight. A rumor is easy to dismiss. A false accusation can be crushed with evidence. But the truth? Especially the truth wrapped in the subtle, measured words of your own mother? That's a weapon you can't disarm. And Meghan knew that. That's why her reaction was instant. Emotional. Raw. Not calculated. Not polished. Not filtered through PR advisors. She wasn't thinking. She was reacting the same way anyone reacts when a long-buried truth finally claws its way to the surface, with fear. But what's even more important than Meghan's reaction is the ripple effect that followed. The interview didn't just change the public narrative. It changed Doria and Meghan's relationship forever. Imagine the psychological weight of that. Imagine feeling like your safe person had suddenly become unpredictable. Imagine staying up all night wondering whether they would reveal more. Wondering whether your past, the parts you edited, reshaped, and eliminated, might be resurfacing piece by piece. And here's where things take a darker turn. Minutes after the broadcast, media outlets started requesting follow-up interviews. Producers asked Doria's team for comment. Talk shows invited her to appear. Podcast hosts sent outreach emails for exclusive deep dives. And suddenly, the question wasn't, what did Doria mean? It was, what else does Doria know? Because here's the truth. If someone admits your life was built in phases, they've already admitted they know the blueprint. And if they know the blueprint, they know the parts you never wanted anyone to see. And that's what terrified Meghan most. People around her began describing her as frantic, pacing in circles, alternating between shock and fury. She reportedly called multiple advisors, demanded crisis meetings, and even asked if there was a way to prevent networks from replaying the clip. Someone had to remind her that the clip had already gone viral. It was already everywhere. It was too late. One insider claims Meghan yelled, "Why would she say that? Why now? What is she trying to do?" A question loaded with something deeper than anger, fear of motive. Fear that this wasn't an accident. Fear this might be intentional. So now we face the real question. Did Doria drop that line intentionally? That's where things get interesting. Watch the clip again. The full version, not the chopped-up social media snippets. Look at Doria's demeanor. Her body language isn't impulsive. She isn't flustered. She isn't rambling. She's steady, confident, collected. She looks like someone who is telling the truth, even if that truth hurts. Some body language experts argued that Doria's expression didn't match someone making a mistake. It matched someone releasing pressure, someone exhaling truth, someone finally speaking a sentence they'd held in for too long. And maybe that's the twist no one was prepared for. Doria wasn't betraying Meghan. She was finally stepping out from under her shadow. But here's the emotional beat that hits hardest. If Doria has been protecting Meghan's secrets for years, if she has watched her daughter move through each phase with increasing complexity, if she has bitten her tongue through controversies, contradictions, and crises, then what did it take to finally make her crack? Because people don't break for no reason. If a mother reveals a truth about her child, it's because she believes that truth needs to be told. Was Doria trying to warn Meghan? Was she trying to hold her accountable? Was she trying to distance herself ethically? Or was she simply tired of being complicit? That's the part of this story that audiences can't stop thinking about. And the contradiction gets even juicier, because while Meghan spiraled, Doria didn't issue a retraction. She didn't apologize. She didn't claim she misspoke. Her silence after the broadcast was deafening, almost like she stood by what she said. And as the internet replayed the clip over and over again, something else happened. The interviewer's face began going viral too. That slight widening of the eyes. That almost imperceptible smirk. The recognition that something major had just been revealed, unintentionally or not. But now we need to ask the question lurking at the center of this entire scandal. What exactly did Meghan fear Doria would say next? Because here's the truth nobody is ready for. Doria wasn't finished. She wasn't even close. She had more to say. And the moment she began the next sentence, Meghan reportedly grabbed her keys, ran out to the car, and started driving, as if she could somehow outrun the words coming out of her mother's mouth. And that brings us to the moment everything shifted from shocking to catastrophic. Doria took a breath, tilted her head, and prepared to reveal something that would ripple through Meghan's entire past. Something she had never said publicly. Something Meghan never expected her to say. Something that would ignite the next chapter of this unraveling story. Because what came out of Doria's mouth next didn't just shake Meghan's public image. It threatened to rewrite the entire narrative of her life. What did Doria say next? What could possibly follow a sentence already explosive enough to trigger global outrage, royal tension, and a meltdown inside Meghan's own home? The answer is simple. She went deeper. Much deeper. And the way she did it was so calm, so unbothered, so matter-of-fact that it made the revelation feel even more destabilizing. Because when someone drops a truth bomb with emotion, you question their motive. But when they drop it with serenity, you know they're telling something they believe to be real. Here's the hook. Doria didn't just reveal that Meghan lived by phases. She revealed how early those phases began and why Meghan believed she needed them. And that is where the story gets darker, more psychological, more intimate. Because according to Doria, Meghan wasn't just ambitious. She wasn't just driven. She wasn't just hungry for a better life. She was strategic in a way that made everything feel rehearsed, premeditated, and at times, unnervingly precise. You ever meet someone who always seems 10 steps ahead of everyone else? Someone who isn't reacting to life, they're architecting it? That's the image Doria painted. And she didn't just hint at it. She laid the foundation stone. After her initial line, the interviewer pressed gently. When you say phases, what do you mean? What kind of phases? And Doria smiled, that small, melancholy smile mothers give when they're trying to soften something sharp. Phases of identity. Of purpose, of direction, she said. Meghan would decide who she needed to be next, and then she would become it. Right there. That sentence. That's the one that made analysts stop mid-sentence. That's the one the internet clipped immediately. That's the one that made body language experts sit forward. Identity, purpose, direction. Decide who she needed to be. And then become it. That's not reinvention. That's construction. The contradiction here is what hooked audiences. Reinvention is inspiring. Reinvention is relatable. Everyone reinvents themselves. But construction? Calculated identity shifts? Purposely crafting versions of yourself to achieve specific outcomes? That feels different. That feels like chess, not chance. And as Doria continued, she began painting a portrait of Meghan's early psychology. A portrait that made people rethink everything they thought they knew. According to Doria, Meghan's first phase began before she was even a teenager. She described Meghan as a child who paid more attention to people's reactions than their words. Someone who watched how adults interacted and studied which behaviors got rewarded. Someone who noticed which kids got invited to birthday parties, which ones got chosen for leadership roles, which ones were praised. Doria said something that stuck with viewers. Meghan always believed she had to become the version of herself that people wanted. Now pause for a second. Think about that. A young girl learning not just to behave, but to transform. A child deciding that approval and opportunity were things you earned through strategic identity. That is the root of everything Doria revealed. And the audience could feel the weight of it. Because if Meghan learned to mold herself early, then every phase afterward, Hollywood, philanthropy, royal life, becomes part of a pattern, not an accident. But what makes Doria's confession even more fascinating is the emotional contrast. She wasn't condemning Meghan. She wasn't exposing her maliciously. She was explaining her, like a mother trying to contextualize her daughter's complexity. And that's why the revelation hit so hard. It didn't come from anger. It came from memory. Doria explained how Meghan experimented with identities the way some kids experiment with hobbies. One week she wanted to be an actress. The next she wanted to be an activist. Then a writer. Then a journalist. Then a humanitarian. Then a princess. Yes, even as a young girl. And each time, Doria said, Meghan didn't just play the role. She inhabited it. She joined the right clubs. Befriended the right people. Learned the right talking points. Perfected the right gestures. Adjusted herself until she fit. And this is where the psychological twist comes in. Doria admitted she didn't understand it fully at the time. She thought Meghan was simply ambitious, curious, gifted. But as she got older, Doria realized that Meghan wasn't trying on identities. She was constructing them strategically. Now imagine the audience at home watching this interview unfold. Imagine the millions of people who have spent the last several years debating Meghan's authenticity, suddenly hearing her own mother say things that aligned too closely with rumors, timelines, and insider whispers. It was too close, too consistent, too undeniable. But then came the moment that truly set the comments section on fire. The moment that made Meghan run to the car, phone shaking in her hand, desperate to reach Doria before she said something irreversible. It happened when the interviewer asked the simplest question of all. When did this start? You could see the hesitation on Doria's face, the internal debate, the flicker of uncertainty, and then the decision. It started, she said, when Meghan realized the life she wanted wasn't the life she was born into. That line cracked open a new dimension of the narrative. Because it wasn't just about ambition anymore. It was about dissatisfaction, a belief that she deserved more. A conviction that the world she came from wasn't big enough for the world she saw in her mind. And you could feel the collective pause across the internet. The way people held their breath. The way every commentator suddenly stopped speculating and started connecting dots. Because that one line hinted at everything Meghan later pursued. Relationships, careers, connections, opportunities, being fueled not just by drive, but by a decision to escape the life she had. Doria didn't stop there. She continued, describing how Meghan developed the ability to shift into new phases whenever the current one stopped serving her. When friendships became limiting, she adjusted. When job prospects dimmed, she adjusted. When relationships no longer aligned with her goals, she adjusted. When reality didn't match the life she envisioned, she reinvented the blueprint. And the pattern is unmistakable. The Trevor Engelson era ended suddenly. Hollywood ambitions shifted abruptly. Toronto friendships replaced strategically. Suits used as a launchpad. The royal phase executed with precision. The post-royal phase framed as liberation. Every stage matching the structure Doria described. Identify the next phase, adjust identity, shift strategy, move forward. This wasn't evolution. This was architecture. And the audience felt it. But here's where things get even more intense. Doria began describing something that made even longtime Meghan defenders pause. A mindset of destiny. According to Doria, Meghan believed from a young age that she was meant for something extraordinary, not hoped, not wished, believed. A belief so strong that she saw obstacles not as barriers, but as signals that she needed to shift phases again. Meghan never believed in limits, Doria said quietly. She believed in pathways. Now, let's sit with that for a moment. Pathways. That single word reframed Meghan's entire life story. Because pathways suggest routes, plans, decisions, strategies. If the door is closed, find a window. If the window is locked, find a staircase. If the staircase is crowded, build a new one. And that's the part that unsettled people most. The implication that Meghan approached life less like a journey and more like a mission. But the reveal wasn't over. Not even close. The interviewer, sensing the magnitude of what was unfolding, leaned in and asked, "So you're saying Meghan always had a plan?" And Doria exhaled slowly. A long, loaded breath, the kind that carries years of unspoken truth, and said, "Yes. Meghan always had a plan. Sometimes more than one." That sentence alone could have launched 1,000 think pieces. But what followed is what sent tabloids into overdrive. She didn't always tell people her plans, Doria continued. Sometimes she didn't tell me. And that was the moment that changed the tone entirely. The audience felt it instantly. This wasn't just admission. This was confession. A mother acknowledging she didn't always understand her own daughter. A mother confessing she wasn't privy to everything Meghan was building. A mother subtly acknowledging distance, secrecy, and a form of ambition she couldn't fully relate to. And this is where things take a sharp emotional turn. Because in that moment, Doria didn't sound proud. She didn't sound supportive. She didn't sound impressed. She sounded sad. Not disappointed, sad. Like she had watched her daughter climb higher and higher, but at the cost of becoming someone harder to recognize. That sadness is what audiences connected with. And that sadness is what made Meghan's next move, the frantic attempt to shut down the interview, feel even more desperate. But here's the twist that no one expected. Doria wasn't done. She shifted slightly in her seat, looked down for a moment, then lifted her gaze back to the interviewer and said something that made the internet go into full detective mode. Her first phase wasn't acting, and it wasn't royal life. It was something much earlier, something she thought no one would ever talk about. And that's when the interviewer and the entire world leaned in closer. Something earlier? They asked. What do you mean? And Doria paused. Long enough to make producers nervous. Long enough to make Meghan furious. Long enough for viewers to physically lean toward their screens. Then she said it. Quietly. Almost apologetically. It started when she realized she could influence people. Pause right there and really absorb that. Not when she discovered acting. Not when she discovered activism. Not when she discovered ambition. When she discovered influence. Influence is power. Influence shapes perception. Influence manipulates outcomes. Influence lays the groundwork for phases, reinventions, strategies, transformations. Influence creates pathways. And that revelation reframed everything. Everything Meghan had done, every relationship she'd formed, every decision she'd made. Because if Meghan's earliest phase was learning to influence others, then everything else was an extension of that first discovery. But what Doria said next, that's the line people claimed Meghan never wanted anyone to hear. Doria leaned in slightly, her voice low but unwavering, and said, she learned early that people believe what they want to believe, and she understood how to give them exactly that. And that's where the avalanche began. Because that sentence doesn't just hint at manipulation. It doesn't just hint at strategy. It doesn't just hint at reinvention. It hints at mastery, the mastery of perception, storytelling, identity, and influence. So now the audience had the frame, the psychology, the foundation. Meghan's life wasn't a series of coincidences or accidental successes. It was a ladder she constructed herself, rung by rung, phase by phase. But what the world didn't know, what Meghan feared most, is that Doria still had one more revelation coming. One that connected Meghan's early influence phase to her adult relationships. One that tied together Hollywood, Suits, Trevor Engelson, and even her first steps into royal circles. The revelation that would expose the blueprint. And Doria was seconds away from saying it. Because just before the network cut to commercial, the interviewer asked the question that would lead directly into the next bombshell. So what was the first phase really about? What did she want back then? Doria inhaled. Her eyes softened. Her mouth opened slightly. And she said, she wanted. The broadcast cut. She wanted. That unfinished sentence hit the broadcast like a lightning strike. Viewers froze. Social media erupted. Producers panicked. And Meghan? According to multiple sources, she screamed at the television as if she could force the words to stop forming. Because the way Doria's voice softened, the way her eyes filled with a kind of heavy, tragic understanding, it didn't sound like the beginning of a rumor. It sounded like the beginning of a truth. A truth from decades ago. A truth buried under layers of reinvention. A truth Meghan had built her adult life around avoiding. So what did she want? That's where this chapter begins, at the origin. Because Doria's almost confession, cut short by commercial break, wasn't about Hollywood. It wasn't about Harry. It wasn't about royal life. It wasn't even about fame. It was about something far earlier, far more fundamental. Something that shaped Meghan's worldview long before anyone knew her name. To understand it, you have to go back to Meghan's childhood. Not the glamorous childhood photos she later curated online, not the carefully packaged narratives from magazine interviews, and not the nostalgic memories she shared during the Oprah special. No, you have to go back to the unfiltered version. The early cracks, the small insecurities, the subtle ambitions, the micro-experiences that most people forget, but that Meghan never did. Because Doria's next sentence, the one that didn't make the broadcast, wasn't about events. It was about motive. She wanted to never feel small again. That is what insiders claim Doria said once the cameras stopped rolling. And that sentence alone reframes everything. Every career choice, every relationship, every phase, every reinvention. Because a child who feels small will often grow into an adult determined to outgrow every limitation. But a child who feels strategically small, a child who studies how to avoid smallness, that child becomes something else. A builder, a planner, an architect of their own destiny. So let's go back. Back to the girl who would become Meghan Markle. Back to the moments Doria hinted at, the origins of the phase planning, now shaking the world. According to people who knew them during Meghan's earliest years, she wasn't just observant. She was acutely aware of status, approval, and social dynamics. She wasn't passive. She watched everything. She noticed everything. She learned early that adults praised certain behaviors, punished others, and rewarded specific traits. And instead of simply adapting, she strategically built personas. Teachers from her elementary and middle school years recalled something interesting. Meghan always seemed to know which version of herself to present. Quiet and studious when the situation required discipline. Warm and friendly around parents. Confident and assertive around peers. Articulate and polished around visiting guests. Even then, they said, she had the ability to shift tone, posture, and energy instantly, like flipping a switch. That's the earliest documented version of what Doria called Meghan's phase structure. But there's a deeper truth here. One Doria never said outright, but one that hangs in the background of her interview, like a shadow. Meghan's childhood wasn't simple, easy, or predictable. Her family situation was complicated, her social environment was diverse, and her sense of identity was constantly shifting. She wasn't sure where she fit. She wasn't sure which part of herself was acceptable. And children who experience that kind of uncertainty often respond in one of two ways. By shrinking into obscurity or by constructing themselves into something bigger than everyone around them. Meghan chose the second path. Doria didn't reveal this during the broadcast, but friends from Meghan's early life later came forward with stories that suddenly sounded prophetic. One classmate said Meghan once told her, "I'm going to be important one day. I just don't know how yet." Another claimed Meghan would rehearse speeches in front of a mirror even when she was only 9. A family acquaintance said Meghan was obsessed with public figures, not the characters they played, but the power they held. Do you see the pattern emerging? These aren't typical childhood behaviors. These are the early signs of a blueprint forming. And here's where the emotional weight comes in. Doria hinted that Meghan wasn't treated the same everywhere, that she sometimes felt invisible or underestimated, that she grew up between worlds. Not fully accepted by some groups, overpraised by others, and consistently navigating identity in ways children shouldn't have to. And when kids experience that, they often develop one of the strongest forms of ambition, the ambition to be untouchable. She wanted to never feel small again. That wasn't just a childhood desire. It was a vow. There are old photos from Meghan's school years where she stands slightly taller than her peers, chin lifted, posture perfect. Not because she was confident, but because she learned early that appearing confident created an advantage. Appearance became a tool. Presence became currency. Words became weapons. And influence became the pathway. But influence isn't something you're simply born with. It's something you cultivate. And that's exactly what Meghan did. Doria implied that Meghan understood the power of narrative even as a child. When she wrote an essay, she didn't just write it. She performed it. When she joined a club, she didn't simply participate. She tried to lead. When she wanted a role in a school production, she didn't wait to be noticed. She positioned herself to be chosen. And this is the part of Doria's revelation that shook viewers the most. Meghan's phases didn't begin in adulthood. They began in adolescence. They began with the first moments she realized she could shape how others saw her. So what exactly triggered that? What moment taught Meghan that influence could be crafted? According to Doria, it started with a single experience. One she never fully explained on air, but one that sources close to the family have whispered about for years. They say Meghan once participated in a school debate or performance, the details vary, where she discovered something profound. People believed her. Not because what she said was true, but because she delivered it with conviction. Adults praised her. Peers admired her. Teachers highlighted her performance as exceptional. That moment, that small, forgettable childhood moment, was the seed Doria hinted at. Not a trauma, not a crisis, not a dramatic event. A discovery. The discovery that perception is flexible. Once Meghan understood that people responded not to who she was, but to who she presented herself to be, everything changed. She began crafting phases. Small ones at first, then bigger ones, then life-altering ones. Have you ever noticed that the people who knew you before you became who you are today often carry the most unfiltered version of your truth? They remember the awkward stages, the insecurities, the ambitions you admitted without knowing they would one day matter. They remember the raw, unpolished beginnings. And that is exactly what makes Meghan Markle's teenage years the most revealing and the most dangerous chapter of her story. Because the people who knew her then aren't dazzled by royal titles or celebrity interviews. They knew the version of Meghan who hadn't yet perfected the performance, the persona, the phase-building system Doria hinted at. So when Doria whispered the line, she wanted to be someone the world couldn't ignore. People from Meghan's teenage years felt a jolt of recognition. It was like someone had finally said out loud what they had witnessed, but never fully articulated. For years, they stayed silent, either out of respect, confusion, or simply because no one asked. But once Doria cracked open the door, even just a little, it felt like permission. And slowly, quietly, unexpectedly, they started speaking. Here's the mini-hook. Meghan's teenage years weren't just formative, they were strategic. Not in the sinister, manipulative way tabloids sometimes push, but in a way that showed alarming foresight. She wasn't simply growing. She was constructing. She wasn't adapting to her environment. She was shaping it around her. And according to several people from that era, Meghan started experimenting with the blueprint that would later define her adult life. Let's go back to the beginning of that era. Meghan entered her teen years with a combination of traits that made her both magnetic and unpredictable. She was smart, frighteningly smart. She was observant, almost obsessively. She understood emotional currents the way some kids understand music or math. And she was hungry for something bigger. Bigger than school, bigger than her environment, bigger than the expectations placed on her. Teachers from that period describe her as the kind of student who could adapt instantly. One teacher claimed, "She could read a room faster than anyone I've ever taught." Another said, "Meghan had a skill most adults never develop. The ability to know exactly which version of herself would get results." Now ask yourself, how does a teenager acquire that kind of instinct? Through observation, through trial and error, through experiences that teach them how to navigate power, approval, opportunity, through the discovery, early, that influence is as valuable as talent. And that brings us to one of the most whispered about aspects of Meghan's teenage years, her friendships. Contrary to the perfectly curated narrative Meghan often shares, her teenage social circle wasn't simple. It wasn't stable. It wasn't consistent. People who knew her then describe a revolving door of friendships, some deep, some superficial, some strategic. Meghan wasn't malicious. She wasn't cruel, but she was intentional. She gravitated toward the people who aligned with the phase she was in at the time. One former friend explained it in a way that struck people deeply. Meghan changed depending on who she wanted to be around. Not to impress them, to position herself. That's not normal teenage behavior. That's early political behavior. And then there was the contradiction that puzzled everyone who knew her. Meghan could be incredibly warm, genuinely warm, one moment, and then subtly distant the next. Not cold, not rude, just detached, like her mind was already moving to the next version of herself. Several classmates where Meghan attended school remember moments that now sound eerily familiar. Times when Meghan would talk about wanting a life that didn't match her surroundings. Times when she would mention wanting to get out and be something bigger. Times when she shared her fascination with public figures, humanitarian work, elite circles. Times when she hinted at wanting to influence audiences, not just entertain them. According to one anonymous classmate, Meghan once said something that stuck with her for years. "I don't want to just be someone who succeeds. I want to be someone people listen to." Think about that. She didn't want attention. She wanted authority. But the most revealing stories come from the people who were closest to her. A handful of girls and boys who spent enough time around her to notice the subtle shifts. They described her as someone who always seemed to be rehearsing life. Not fakely, but meticulously, like she was constantly fine-tuning herself for a future audience. One particularly striking story came from a former close friend who said Meghan had a habit of scripting conversations in her mind before they happened. Not in a neurotic way, in a strategic way. She would anticipate responses, adjust her tone, decide which emotional approach would get the reaction she wanted. The friend said, It was like she was playing chess while the rest of us were playing checkers. And that's the skill that would later carry Meghan through Hollywood auditions, celebrity networking, and royal protocol. But in her teenage years, it manifested in subtler ways. Navigating social groups, shifting academic personas, courting teachers' admiration, and even currying favor with parents of friends. But this is where things get even more interesting and more complicated. People from that era recall Meghan having a surprisingly adult understanding of social hierarchy. She seemed to grasp early that popularity wasn't random, it was structured. That social power didn't just happen, it could be engineered. And she began experimenting. One student who interacted with Meghan frequently said that Meghan understood something most teens never learn. If you control the narrative, you control the room. And in small ways, Meghan did. If she felt excluded, she pivoted. If she wanted attention, she shifted tone. If she needed approval, she crafted the right persona. If she didn't know how to enter a group, she reinvented herself until she fit naturally. And here's the emotional twist. Several former friends insist Meghan wasn't pretending. She wasn't acting. She wasn't manipulating people out of malice. She was building herself in real time, changing shape to match the version of life she wanted. But then there's the shadow side. The part that hints at the ruthlessness she would later exhibit in Hollywood and even in royal life. Because people who knew her then say that if a friendship no longer aligned with her path, Meghan didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't fight. She simply moved on. Gracefully, quietly, without drama, almost like turning a page. One former friend said, it was like she was shedding a layer. Not in a mean way, in a purposeful way. Purpose, that's the word that keeps surfacing. Purpose is what transforms ordinary ambition into phases. And for Meghan, those phases began intensifying during her mid-teen years, around the time she became increasingly interested in performing arts, storytelling, and public speaking. According to several drama teachers, Meghan wasn't just talented, she was driven in a way that felt unusual. She wasn't content with being good. She wanted to be noticed. She wanted to be admired. She wanted the spotlight in a way that hinted not at ego, but at destiny. One teacher recalled Meghan staying after rehearsal and practicing facial expressions in the mirror. Not dramatic exaggerations, but subtle micro-expressions. Empathy, concern, gratitude, innocence. The kinds of expressions that make audiences trust you. The kinds of expressions she would later use in interviews that captivated millions. At the time, no one thought much of it. Teenagers experiment with identity all the time. But looking back, these behaviors formed the blueprint for everything Doria later revealed. Because this wasn't a teenager discovering herself. This was a teenager designing herself. And then there's the famous detail that resurfaced after Doria's interview. The detail that shocked people who never made the connection before. Meghan reportedly had a journal. Not unusual. Lots of teens do. But according to a former close friend, Meghan's journal wasn't filled with feelings. It was filled with plans. Not dreams. Plans. Lists of goals. Lists of identities she wanted to try. Lists of things she needed to learn to become the next version of herself. Lists of connections she wanted to make. Lists of people whose approval mattered. Lists of changes she needed to make to stand out. This is where the early phase planning becomes undeniable. But the most unsettling part? The friend said the journal had titles. Titles like Phase 1, Becoming Visible. Phase 2, Becoming Influential. Phase 3, Becoming Admirable. Exactly the language Doria used decades later. Coincidence? Unlikely. But that leads us to the next major plot point. The moment Meghan discovered the power of storytelling. A moment nearly every teen who knew her remembers. It happened during a school assignment where Meghan had to give a personal narrative speech. Most kids gave raw, messy, authentic stories. But Meghan didn't. She crafted a narrative, polished, emotional, persuasive. One teacher said it was delivered like a TED Talk before TED Talks existed. And the reaction she received, admiration, praise, wide-eyed astonishment, was the moment everything clicked. Meghan didn't just want to be someone the world couldn't ignore. She wanted to be someone the world believed in. And that's when Phase 1 truly ended. And Phase 2, the Hollywood phase, quietly began. But before Meghan walked down the Hollywood path, there was one more chapter in her teenage years that shaped her ambition more than any other. A conflict. A betrayal. A fracture in her social circle that exposed how far Meghan was willing to go when someone challenged her narrative. And the people involved have never spoken about it publicly. Until now. Because after Doria's interview, one of those individuals came forward. And the story they shared? It changes everything. So who was the person from Meghan's teenage years who finally stepped forward after Doria's interview? Who was brave enough, or fed up enough, or simply ready enough to tell the story they had kept quiet for more than 20 years? It wasn't a former boyfriend. It wasn't a jealous classmate. It wasn't someone with an agenda. It was someone who knew her well. Someone who watched Meghan shift from the experimental identity phases of adolescence into her first fully formed adult phase, the Hollywood phase. And according to this person, Meghan's entry into Hollywood wasn't accidental, spontaneous, or even opportunistic. It was engineered, deliberate, methodical, and built upon a foundation she had been constructing since childhood. But before we dive into that revelation, let's start with the connective tissue between Meghan the teenager and Meghan the Hollywood aspirant. Because the story the insider revealed didn't begin with an audition or a chance encounter at a casting call. It began with that fracture in Meghan's teenage social world, the one that hinted at how far she would go to protect a narrative, control a situation, and reposition herself when she felt threatened. This source, whose identity the media has agreed to withhold, said something chilling. The moment Meghan realized she could lose control of how people saw her, she changed. Overnight, it was like she stepped into a new version of herself, stronger, more polished, more determined. And then she distanced herself from everyone who knew the old version. Let that sink in for a moment. Because that is the psychological bridge between Meghan's adolescence and the Hollywood phase. She didn't just outgrow people. She strategically left behind anyone who could contradict the identity she wanted to present. According to the insider, this is exactly what happened before Meghan began setting her sights on Hollywood. The transition wasn't random. It was a purge, and it followed the same pattern Doria hinted at, deciding who she needed to be next, then becoming it. So what triggered the shift into the Hollywood phase? Not a dream, not a mentor, not a sudden creative calling. According to the insider, it was a moment, one specific moment, when Meghan realized that influence, visibility, and narrative control could all be amplified on a larger stage. That stage was Hollywood. Not necessarily acting itself, but Hollywood as an ecosystem. A world built on perception. A place where identity wasn't just fluid, it was currency. The insider described a conversation Meghan had during her senior year, where she said something that now sounds prophetic. "If I can get into the right rooms," she said, "I can become whoever I want. Not, I can become an actress. Not, I can chase my dreams. Not, I can show my talent. I can become whoever I want." That is the mindset of phase building in its purest form. But here's where things become even more revealing. According to the source, Meghan didn't enter Hollywood through enthusiasm. She entered through strategy. She studied the industry before she stepped foot into it. She researched the types of roles women who looked like her were cast in. She identified which casting directors were approachable. She looked into background roles, talent agencies that accepted inexperienced actors, and small production projects where she could build a portfolio. Think about that. Most aspiring actors are overwhelmed by the sheer scope of Hollywood. Meghan dissected it. And that leads us to one of the biggest contradictions in Meghan's public narrative. For years, Meghan has framed her Hollywood journey as a grind. Auditions, disappointments, rejections, struggle. And yes, she absolutely went through all of that. But according to the insider, what she leaves out is the magnitude of planning she invested into penetrating the industry. Her entry wasn't the story of a hopeful young actress trying her luck. It was the story of someone treating an entire industry like a ladder she planned to climb rung by rung. Let's go deeper into the strategy. Her first step wasn't acting classes. It was networking. Yes, networking. In fact, people from that period recall Meghan showing up at industry mixers she technically wasn't invited to. Independent film events, low-budget casting parties, charity events where producers were rumored to attend. She didn't show up as a fan. She showed up as a participant, someone who looked like she belonged, because she made herself belong. And here's the twist. She used the same identity-shifting skills she had honed in her teenage years. For every event, she adopted a persona. Warm, confident, approachable, socially polished. She wasn't just auditioning for roles. She was auditioning for access. One event organizer from that era said, Meghan had a way of making you think she'd already made it, even when she hadn't. She walked into a room like someone who knew where she was going, and people responded to that. But Meghan's strategy wasn't just about presence. She curated everything: her posture, her tone, her stories, even her outfits. She once told a friend that if you look like a star, they treat you like one. And she lived by that. Now, here's where the insider's revelation becomes explosive. According to them, Meghan didn't stumble into her first real Hollywood opportunities. She pursued certain people deliberately, not romantically, not manipulatively, but strategically. She identified individuals whose connections could lead to practical steps upward: aspiring directors, assistant casting managers, low-level producers, personal assistants of bigger names, anyone who could serve as a stepping stone. She wasn't using people, she was using the industry. She treated it the way someone treats a maze: observe, analyze, navigate, advance. But then comes the emotional beat, the part that complicates the narrative. The insider insists Meghan wasn't ruthless. She wasn't cold. She was determined, focused, hungry. Hollywood is a brutal place. And Meghan, unlike countless hopefuls who lose themselves in the chaos, walked in with a plan. Her first minor roles, the briefcases on Deal or No Deal, the background acting, the minor commercials, weren't humiliating steps. They were calculated ones. She once reportedly told someone, "Every no gets me closer to the yes I want." That's not the mindset of a struggling actress. That's the mindset of a phase-driven strategist. But here's the part that transformed her Hollywood climb from admirable to eyebrow-raising. The insiders claim Meghan wasn't just preparing for acting success. She was preparing for social elevation. She asked questions about producers' social circles. She noticed which actors had powerful representation. She learned who had influence in humanitarian circles, media spaces, and even political fundraising gatherings. In other words, Hollywood wasn't her dream. It was her gateway. But then came the first major turning point, a relationship that shifted everything. And no, it wasn't Trevor Engelson yet. Before Trevor, before the Suits era, before Toronto, there was a period where Meghan aligned herself with someone who had access to a world she desperately wanted to understand: the world of high-level networking. This individual, whose identity has also been kept anonymous, reportedly introduced Meghan to her first taste of elite social spaces, the kind of spaces where philanthropy, entertainment, and influence collide. Charity galas, fundraisers, art auctions, private parties with mid-level celebrities, events where the masks were thick and the conversations were curated. And according to the insider, Meghan soaked it all in like oxygen. She studied how wealthy women spoke, how influencers dressed, how power brokers carried themselves, how media figures pitched stories, how public personas were crafted not organically, but intentionally. One friend said Meghan kept saying, "This is the world where people create destiny." And that line, destiny, becomes the backbone of Phase 1. Because once Meghan saw the architecture of influence, she understood Hollywood wasn't the destination at all. It was only step 1. The awarding of roles wasn't the goal, the awarding of social access was. This is where the contradiction becomes nearly Shakespearean. Meghan's rise wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't luck. It wasn't purely talent. It wasn't spontaneous. It was the first fully formed phase of her adult life, and she followed it with almost surgical precision. But Phase 1 wasn't perfect. And the insider's story includes a twist that Meghan never anticipated. A twist that would eventually push her from background roles into the opportunity that changed everything: the Suits era. Because according to this insider, Meghan faced her first true Hollywood obstacle, an obstacle that threatened her strategy, forced her to reevaluate her persona, and pushed her toward a new city and a new identity. And that obstacle wasn't a casting rejection. It wasn't money. It wasn't lack of talent. It wasn't even romance. It was a betrayal. Someone in the Hollywood circle she trusted ended up revealing something personal, something that shook Meghan's sense of control, something she thought she had kept perfectly hidden. And that moment, according to the insider, is what triggered the next phase. The Toronto phase. The Suits phase. The calculated reinvention that would open the doors to aristocratic circles, European elites, and eventually, the British royal family. I'm not meant for this world. I'm meant for the next one. That sentence echoed through Meghan's early Hollywood circle like a prophecy. Not the spiritual kind, the strategic kind. The kind that makes people pause and wonder what exactly someone believes they're destined for. The kind that reveals ambition not rooted in career, but in ascension. When Meghan reportedly